Welcome to the session, everybody. I'm Kaushik. I'm very glad to be offered a chance to come and speak to all of you. This session is being held in collaboration by Global Speech and Debate Council, the Debate Central, Debating WhatsApp, and Horatio Podium. Today, we'll be covering quite a few things. I hope this will be an engaging session for all of you, mostly because I think this will be contributing to your discussions and abilities to become better in terms of analyzing motions and reading about different spaces where you're not very familiar about the topics or issues. What essentially will be covered is first, we'll be doing a brief rundown as to how debates or how debaters are approaching different themes and different contexts around those themes, how debate motions are set, and how you can approach themes from different sources. Second, we'll sort of like discuss how news and current affairs get relevant into the debate scope. And also, in the end, we'll discuss how to read motions better and read context better by taking some examples and breaking them down so that it becomes easier for all of you to digest. Right. I'm sorry. I'm a bit sick, so you'll often hear me coughing. So I just hope that you can pardon me for all of those interruptions from time to time. Right. Let's begin. So, first things first, what is the background behind the relevance of this workshop and why are we doing this workshop? So, the idea behind reading as a debater or gaining knowledge as a debater is simply the premise that, right, there is a lot of different aspects in which the debate motions come from, but also there are topics which are more relevant and how we sort of like factor into the discussion, different ideas and different perspectives. It not just gives us an idea about how to go ahead and approach a motion, but it also gives us an idea about how not to approach a motion, in the sense that what is not within the content framework of what a motion dictates or what a motion doesn't dictate. So you would often find that debates are based on various different themes, right? So this might be religion, this might be sports, this might be economics, this might be finance. So you have all of these different perspectives that you can sort of engage with. So once you have a basic awareness about these areas, it is much more easier for you to approach these areas more proactively and more productively. So I'll just give a brief overview as to how do you actually approach researching or reading on different themes and different issues, and give you current sources which might be relevant to you or other sources in which you can find information regarding certain topics or regarding certain matters. Secondly, I think we'll also be discussing more about how those news can be sort of biased and how those biases might creep into your debating and which you need to sort of be careful about. So first things first, let's just give you a couple of general rundown as to how different sources work and how different things are approached in terms of the space. For example, when you're talking about things like economics or things like law and other policy mechanisms, there are a lot of different sources that you can gather, right? So I'll give you a rundown theme by theme. In economics, you can possibly approach things in general by Wikipedia and other issues. You will be surprised when I'm saying this, of course, because sometimes Wikipedia becomes very like convoluted. But the problem is that often debaters, when they're reading news and when they're reading articles and when they're reading academic papers or blogs or other things to get awareness, they don't really go into the minuscule detail as possible, because I think in certain cases only the definition and aspects of different things within a motion context or within the context of the debate is relevant, and on top of that frameworks are needed to be built, which then needs your specialized knowledge. So what essentially happens is, for example, if you're taking a motion on things like theology or things like politics, it is easier for you to ideate when you're understanding what the leftist, centrist or rightist aspects are and how different things sort of parlay in the conversation in and of itself. So this is something you have to be careful about, and therefore I think one of the fundamental things which I would recommend that you go and read to gain awareness is to gain awareness about different topics through channels like Wikipedia, through channels like repositories like Science Direct and other places where you find much more relevant and simplistic articles for you to approach. There are other things as well. So in terms of, say, if you have MUN experiences or if you have like debating experiences, you would see that news are not really neutral. So there are certain news channels which are not really portraying an unbiased perspective. So there are very few channels which people often say that you can go and refer to in terms of like researching or ideating, and these things would be something very relevant to you. So a complete breakdown would sort of go beyond the scope of the session, because simply there's just an unending amount of, say, websites to cover, articles to cover, blogs to cover, and other details to cover. So, what we'll essentially do for you is that I will give you like a link to a spreadsheet which has different aspects of how different knowledge banks are built and how different aspects of say motions are read in terms of the debate, in terms of how also news channels are there which will be subscribing to a particular theme better. Like for example, the New York Times might be good, or the Economic Times might be good for reading, say, things like economics. And in certain political situations, places like Reuters and BBC and other places are there where some amount of relevant current news and affairs are available to you. But more we'll focus on how we break down motions and how we like do reading of motions in the context of themes. So I would encourage that all of you do participate as much as possible, so that this session becomes very encouraging and very also fruitful to you as well. So what we'll do right now is I'll give you an example about how motion breakdown occurs and how motion analysis occurs. This is in terms of how reading context and reading motions work. And then I will give you a relevance as to how you can approach the idea of that theme better. So let's just start with one. Right. I have dropped it in the chat. This that Australia should develop nuclear weapons. This is the motion for us. Let's just break it down into different pieces. So how I read different motions vary. So what essentially happens is in my workshops that I take or in my classes that I take, I usually subscribe to this idea that every word has sort of like an interconnectedness towards different ideas or towards different themes, and that helps you develop comparatives and cases much better. So, in this example that we are taking here, for example, that you're talking about Australia developing nuclear weapons, you can just split it into different parts. For example, you can split it into Australia should develop nuclear weapons. So, what does this do for us? So, for example, if you link the idea of Australia and weapons, you would link the idea as to why Australia might need weapons, why Australia might need nuclear weapons, why should the weapons themselves be nuclear, why should the development happen. So, all of these ideas come around from interlinked ideas within the motion itself. So, if you break motions down into simpler terms, it becomes easier for you to think about them. Now, how do the motions then relate back to our themes? So, for example, now if I'm talking about economics, if you're talking about, say, aspects like development, or if you're talking about aspects like weapons or nuclear weapons, different economics will work for all of them. For example, if Australia was just buying them, there would be different economics around them. If Australia was developing them, there are different economics around them, because then they'll have to spend money on the program or develop the program. This gives you another idea as to what is the background of, say, Australia in terms of developing nuclear weapons or possessing nuclear weapons. So here the idea is that if you break these down into simpler terms, you can ask yourself six questions: what, who, why, where, when, how. So if you are asking yourself these six patterns of questions and then associating it with, say, the word of the motion, then it becomes easier for you to read. Yes, I encourage questions. Anish, you had a question?
Yeah, given that I, as an average intelligent voter, do not know anything about Australia or what Australia's economy is per se,
Exactly.
is it uncharitable for me to make the logical conclusion that because Australia is an isolated land, because it is farther away from the rest of the world, and it does not have any lot of natural, it is not very easy to invade either by land, sea, or sky, it does not necessarily have the threat to develop nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I don't think it's completely uncharitable, but I think the framing needs a lot more work, because I think if you're saying that there are, say, ecosystems in which Australia is working where they're not really attacked at any point of time, or they don't really have any realistic threat, I think the one simple counter that any team would run with it is that ICBMs exist, right? Intercontinental ballistic missiles exist. So if you're launching it from, say, like Japan or China, there's still a possibility that since this range of weapons are so high, that it might still, a nuclear warhead might still reach Australia. Now, I'll answer the first part of your question in a bit more detail, right? I had this also in terms of analyzing motions or reading into motions. The idea is that even if you do not have spec knowledge, or even if you do not know what the average reasonable voter in this country does, what happens for you is that when you're breaking the motion down into simpler terms, it engages with the core principles as to why, say, different things happen in the world, right? On principle, if you look, why should countries have nuclear weapons? Countries might need to have nuclear weapons because of the idea that their internal security or international perception is very like wrong in the world, or in the way in which their neighbors operate. Maybe they have a realistic security concern or threat, which creates a lot of problems. So, even say we do not know the background or socio-political conditions or economic conditions of Australia, we still get the idea as to what are the premises behind the development of nuclear weapons in the world. So, there's a common base that you can operate from. This is why also you see that there's a lot of interconnectedness between themes, as I was explaining to you. So, if you're now just breaking this thing down and looking at it from a political perspective, development might look at political like incoherence from say people like the environmentalists, people like industrialists who might not enjoy these technologies in this sense, and then also pacifists and other people, right? So even on a political spectrum there are a lot of points of engagement which are there regardless of say the country that you're operating on. Now on how you sort of like weigh it in, that might become confusing to you at times because you do not know how political spectrums would operate or prefer certain things. So that is something that you need to be careful about. Yes, Anish.
The only issue that I have with this motion is that if you're going to go ahead and talk about the incentive for nuclear weapons in the first place, it literally means that you are trying to uphold your own external international security because of the fact that there might be bullies out there like United States or bigger nations that might want to bully you. You want to kind of go ahead and have an equal standing foot towards them. The problem with me, this particular stance is that this kind of can apply to every single nation in the world which is not necessarily of great international standing. How do you necessarily just select Australia out from that group?
Right. So the basic premise is there are two types of material that you can bring in, right? Stock material, which is going to be broadly applicable to a lot of countries. And the second idea is that you can apply like very particular spec knowledge about countries in and of themselves. So even if you're running stock things, on certain things, if you weigh them correctly, there is possibility for you to win. So I'm sure that you would say that, right, Australia is going to prioritize its internal affairs, is going to prioritize national security. If there is a perceived threat, Australia needs to act on that perceived threat. Now, how do you paint the world building where you perceive that threat to exist in Australia is very well feasible within how you frame the debate in the first speech or wherever position you are debating from in a debate room, right? The problem then here becomes that your idea is that, right, how do I tie things back to Australia? Let's not think of this as Australia. Let's think of this just as a government or just as, say, a country. If we do not have any idea about Australia, we still have ideas about what government prioritizes or what government incentives are. So we would be not like wrong to assume that in cases like Australia, also in spaces, there will be the same amount of application or applicability or the same amount of like necessity for taking that action as a government in that country. So what I'm trying to tell you here is essentially that there will be times when you are confused or when you are not able to read into the motion or when you're not able to like decipher the motion. How do you like then ideate and how do you like in principle apply yourself to that motion is what this process is all about. I hope that clarifies your question. Is there anything else that you want to ask?
No, no, thanks a lot.
Perfect. So I think this is more or less clear now. So if I'm talking about things like history, that becomes more problematic. We can talk about history of nuclear weapons pretty broadly because that might be something which is more accessible to people, but history about Australia's engagement with developing nuclear weapons is something which might not be spec knowledge. So that is why I'm asking that you always break down different parts of the motion into smaller segments, which helps you like ideate and perform better in the way in that you're ideating for constructives in that motion itself. Now, since this was supposed to always be an interactive workshop, and at the end, I will provide you resources in terms of gathering knowledge and materials and where to read, including how to develop matter files and all. I would now like open the floor for discussions on different motion types. I'll be putting the motions on the chat, so please refer to them there, and then we can sort of like have a discussion as to how we are reading motions differently and how we are sort of like prepping in those motion spaces. Right. I'll give you like a minute to go through this motion as well. Please take your time.
Do we like go gov or op? Do we select who is gov, who
You
is
can
op?
go any side. That's not a problem. We are just going to like go into deciphering the motion first and see how we break it down. Then we can sort of like encourage constructives from particular sides. All right. So what I would do when I'm reading this motion off the bat, right? What I would differentiate it as, I would say that there is a state, the state is occurring with has an aging population. They're opting for policies. The policies are, say, either increasing immigration or say encouraging citizens to have more children. So what I can now then do is then I can ideate as to how aging population is linked to having more children, or how aging population is linked to increasing immigration, and so on and so forth, and then we can build the points for it. The first idea then, if you're running it, would be maybe analyzing it through an economic perspective, or maybe analyzing it to a statehood perspective. So there are different ways in which you can approach. That being said, now let's just have a quick discussion within the room as to how this motion can better be then debated, or what kind of arguments come in. Anish, I saw you unmuted. Do you have anything to add?
Uh, so basic aging population means declining birth rate. Declining birth rate essentially means that people are not incentivized to have children, probably because the country is not doing well, or because of the fact that it is very expensive and we're say not in the capability of a lot of people to have children in the first place. The problem on op is that the nation does not have has finite resources to the point that it will never be enough to incentivize a person financially to go ahead and have a child. Gut checking this with South Korea or Japan per se, where even if you give monetary incentives, it needs to be in enormous amount. For example, $300,000 per year for a particular child to kind of go ahead and raise a child within a high capitalist city like Seoul or something like that. Rather than that, if you invite immigration, you will have a much higher chance of kind of going ahead, and a much more surer chance of, you know, revitalizing the birth rate. And the birth rate can necessarily also fail on side up, which it has a higher likelihood of succeeding on gov.
Perfect. So now we'll just apply the six questions. How do these immigration policies work? Why do these immigrants actually work in this particular system? Where are these immigrants going to come from? When are these immigrants going to come? And when is it going to stop this policy? And in what sense does this occur? So this is how we sort of like go in depth into, say, the motion, and we can build our arguments further. Anish, would you want to like contribute?
Uh, Say the first question again. Like, what is the
How,
first?
what, when, where, basically. So how
How,
would the
what, and where?
immigration work out?
Hmm.
Where would the immigrants come from? When are we starting or stopping this policy in that sense?
Yeah.
And why are we doing immigration over the
Immigration would necessarily come out of overpopulated countries, especially in the developing world, such as India, Sri Lanka, etc., which not only have an overpopulated populace, but have an overpopulated populace with skilled labor overpopulation, which probably means that you're not going ahead and just giving immigration, as in to say that you're desperate for immigration. You probably can also go ahead and regulate this immigration. Op will be pretty uncharitable to say that this will be a country that is overrun by laborers or completely uneducated people at all points. I think with a lot of ambits of immigrants being very, very skilled and countries having an enormously inflated population of skilled labor, you can also utilize that on your side. Second thing is that even with the overpopulation these people face in their local countries, local residencies, you are going to give them far better job opportunities, lesser competition, better living standards, etc., etc., because of the fact that there isn't, I think, a developing country in this world with an aging population. I think aging population only happens in countries that are pretty developed to almost developed to that particular standard, because of the fact that it just becomes because people are at least aware of the fact that you need to stop having children, which they are not in, let us say, very, very dirt poor developing countries. The aspect is that because you want a job and because you kind of need a job to live, I think this transition would be pretty, pretty. intense and enormous to begin with at all points in time. You're flooding these particular immigrants with a lot of incentives to kind of come over here, for example, loosening of visas, like giving them more job opportunities, etc., etc. At the same time, giving them better wage rates and something that is a win-win situation for you as well as this particular person at all points in time.
Right. Would
Immigrant.
anybody else want to engage with Anish? I encourage you to, since this is sort of like a session for you to have a discussion about how you do motion prep and motion readings better. I think that would be something that will help you out a lot. Anybody wants to respond to some problems? Because I think there were a couple of things which needed a bit more clarification. One of them being safeguards. How do you safeguard the immigration policies or immigrants from not overflowing? A couple of pieces of next level of framing that we need to have. I think Anish would also contribute to that in due course. Right. Anybody else? What about having more children? What would the op case be here? Okay, I'll just do the op case. I'll ask Anish a couple of questions and clarification. Anish, I think
I
one
think
of
I
the
can contribute to op case as well, if you would
sure, go
prefer.
ahead. Please go ahead.
All right, all right. So I think for me, I was quite interested in looking at the aspect for the op case. I think few pushes that we can go ahead and put forward in this debate, if let us say you're considering it as a democratic state, is that there are certain problems that come with the inherent notion of immigration itself, right? Let us say you run policies, and this is on a pragmatic weighing. I think it's easier for us to weigh out the fact that pushing for a policy that allows for some reward incentive based benefit scheme for citizens who are like more invested into creating further progeny within their families, or in trying to raise diverse families through, let us say, adoption procedures, basically engaging the community of within itself within a particular state. I think that on a weighing scale, it's easier to prove why that is more beneficial than to go ahead and prove why there is a necessity for, let us say, immigration policies to be built forward. Primarily then comes the fact that on a general awareness, immigration policies mean that you need to spend further resources out of your pockets as the government to, let us say, set up structures and substructures necessary to, number one, first get these immigration procedures fulfilled. Number two, go ahead, approve and ratify which people are eligible for such said immigrations. Number three, then go ahead and provide competitive and comparative benefits that the said lucrative population that you're trying to get into the immigration policy of yours, which means that you'll then have to go do thorough research on competing nations which might have similar immigration policies, as is the norm currently, as seen in like quite a few European countries. And you might also have to go ahead and understand intrinsically what are the challenges that these segments of the population might be facing in their home country, and hence try to create lucrative policies that allow for these particular problems to be removed. Let us say, for example, the UAE, they have low taxes that allow people to have like a better conducive environment for them to grow their wealth, which is one of the most important lucrative hooks that they utilize to, let us say, call in for immigration. Though this is a policy that they don't necessarily utilize to go ahead and, let us say, increase population within their nation. So I think on a weighing scale, it's easier for me to prove that why policies that encourage citizens to be more, let us say, interested in developing their progeny further, or like increasing their progeny, or like let us say having more adoption happening within their economy, is something that helps us in not only one manner but more than one, because existing substructures already exist for these things to happen, which means that as a government you are just probably pushing in more funding or pushing in more resources to ensure that these substructures are now working to the best of their capacity. I mean, earlier they might have been lagging, but now you have further policies that go ahead and talk about having a greater number of progeny, or like that talk about the benefits of adoption, or provide like internal schemes. This means, number one, there is no security risk of you thinking who is this person that you are bringing in, and hence you don't need like tons and dozens of background checks, etc., etc. You don't need to go ahead and collaborate with other economies, etc., etc. You don't need to set up like a lot of other systems. You don't need to think of lucrative policies that might be necessary to call in these people. You don't need to find that X factor that might be the tipping point for these individuals to like consider your country as an easier or viable alternative. You don't need to go ahead and work on your immigration policies, because a lot of the times a lot of countries have very strict immigration policies. Like, it's not that easy for someone from another country to just migrate there. And also it takes into consideration the fact that people are automatically disincentivized for from going from one place to the other, because they feel like, oh my god, my life is going to change, I'm going to be away from the rest of my family, the place that I grew up in, etc., etc.
Great. I think Bracy wanted to add something, and then we can have Anish also.
Okay, confirm I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm not sure how this idea fits in, but I think there is a chart here about how any state has got like privilege that at all times it fulfill to its most proximate population, that is people inherently identify as being of that country. So whenever you have got immigration, that is to say, in the long run, the country has to scatter benefits from things like the advantages that come from that country actively having a larger population which is active within economic generation. The likelihood is you are likely to get like a principled harm because the state is now fulfilling a duty to people who are secondary than its primary population. Probably you can impact this with things like it's likely to get clash because people inherently don't necessarily like the people who come into their country under immigration terms. So to tone down things like backlash, it's most probably better to have people birthing their own children within that country because of like their citizenhood. But secondly, the whole idea of in any case scenario, the country has got the biggest duty to fulfill to its primary stakeholders, which are citizens within that country. So probably it's better for people to have their children such that benefits are scattered amongst them rather than children who actively emanate from immigrants. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Great ideas. I think Anish, you also wanted to add something.
Yeah, I'm mostly gonna still kind of go ahead and give Gov's case. The only thing is that with Sugar's case, on the aspect of resources, that you're gonna spend a lot of resources on the regulation of this immigration. I think that only works if you're a country like North Korea, who is completely closed off from the world and has no built-in immigration regulation altogether, or does not tolerate immigration to any extent in current status quo before this motion takes place. Which means to say that this particular country does go ahead and let immigrants come in at all points in time, because that is literally how you go ahead and trade with other nations, literally go ahead and don't create animosity within other nations, not have actual trade partners, confidence in the international communities, etc., etc. Which probably means that you may have going to have a little bit more funding to be put in within these structures to kind of maintain them with for more volume resistance for a long period of time, but probably not to the point in which you are going ahead and losing a huge chunk of your economy. I think this is something that is overstated on Gov. Secondly, on the aspect of Bracy's point, on the aspect of secondary class citizens, I think this only works, or the inherent assumption is the fact that uh, you are talking about people who are so into the nationalist sentiment of their country that they're willing to forego their individual benefits to go ahead and sacrifice whatever of their personal lives for the sake of the country. Which means to say, you cannot necessarily go ahead and say that, okay, I am going to still bring a child into this world because my nation demands it, not because of the fact that I will still be dirt poor if I want to raise this child, or I probably don't think that this is a very good place to raise this child at all points in time, but I'll still bring a child in this world, still make that child suffer under either poverty or under the problems of a bad education system or a bad job market like I have suffered because of the sake of the nation. I necessarily don't know why this particular person will forego all of their individual benefits and will be so into the guise of nationalism at all points in time. But secondly, I don't necessarily think immigrants are secondary citizens, and I don't know if that's a problematic case to run or not. But it's the fact that uh, globally speaking, especially in a world of globalization, especially when you have countries such as the US, which is the melting pot of all cultures, I necessarily don't think there should be a difference after a period of time between an immigrant and a natural born quote unquote citizen. The problem is the same problems. This problem is if you're going to have this sentiment in society that an immigrant is different to me in citizen and class, one, you have inherent unjust social hierarchies when it comes to, and this leads to them being treated unfairly and unjustly in society. But secondly, this means that they cannot normalize into your society. It probably means that I, as an Indian person, if probably spent 2 decades in Korea, will probably go ahead and pick up some Korean attributes. And even if worst case, there is some sort of fusion culture between India and Korea, why is that so bad? Because people literally don't want to have kids of your native populace in your land to begin with in the first place.
Fair. Yes, you raised
So
your
I
hand.
think,
Can we have
if
the
I may,
person who has raised their hand and then we can take you, Shiv? No problem.
all right, sure.
Ma'am, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Please go ahead.
Okay, so for me, I think I'm taking it from the opposition side. I think also countries have ties with their historic nature and also things like socialization. So in a case where we want childbirth, I think it's very important because then we think those children are able to get that opportunity to be part of that community, and aside that, also get those kind of traits or those kind of historic thing and carry it on, because understand that immigrants wouldn't have that kind of experience. So if children that are birthed in that particular country, they owe it to the country to be able to do things like that. Because if I'm an immigrant, I don't see the need to be, let's say, that's patriotic to a particular country, because at the end of it all, I'm not really from there, in as much as I still get things I want. But then it's very different from somebody who is a part of the country. So that is my thoughts on that.
Very true. Yeah, Shiv, you wanted to add something. Shubhajyoti? I'm assuming they're facing some audio issues. Right, very interesting discussion. I think there is a balance in terms of how we are trying to portray these aspects, right? So you have to be a bit more careful in terms of immigration policies because there have other places in terms of like problems where you don't have enough safeguards, people might be overpopulated. I think those discussions are very relevant in terms of this framework or this motion. Let's try doing one more. Um, I'll just post it in the chat. You can take some time.
Kaushik, are we prepping straight away, or there is need for motion analysis? You are muted.
I'm so sorry. I couldn't hear you. Could you please repeat?
Okay, I was asking if we are going straight to motion prep, or we do some analysis on the second motion.
We will go into, say, case prep directly and we'll sort of have arguments for them. The motion analysis is sort of the same in terms of how you're breaking it down, right? So you'll sort of like break it down into how bands operate in the world and how, say, preaching is different from, say, circulating or gospel or other aspects. And then religion in public becomes very different from religion in private, right? So I think there are interconnectedness between these parts of the motion, as we had already discussed in the first motion aspect, how to break motions down into simpler segments and what are the relations to the motions. So how I would look at this is simply around the ideas of how theology works in general, maybe how politics operate in the guise of religion, how the difference occurs when you are doing it publicly or you're doing it privately, and what does this ban would look like in, say, countries with large scale religious population, or maybe in countries where there is religious divide to a great extent, and also places where there are religious minorities who face some problems. So I'll give you these ideas. We can then take the constructives from all of you as well when we discuss further. You can take a couple of minutes to prep on the motion from any side which you prefer.
Uh,
You want to
can
go
I
first?
try?
Yes, please go on.
Okay. I think we can run an idea here. This doesn't reflect on my faith, by the way. But, anyways, I think we can run an idea on how probably religion, in and of it oneself, has got people who opt into it, i.e., within private premises, there are days where people actively go to church and probably get like their religious juicing over time. But what happens is religion is very oppressive in and of it oneself. It captures people who actively opt into it. Those people probably lose some form of a logic, because in any case scenario, you find out that such people generally ought to think that, well, certain things that are logically incomprehensible are supposed to be permitted to happen because their religion permits them to think in that particular kind of way. So the chat then becomes about what is the better method to save the few people who are actively free in current status quo and not hinged upon the idea like of coercive religion. Because when people who preach religion in public particularly preach it, the likelihood is they do two things. They preach it such that it's so compelling that at least they obtain some form of followers. What we think is, because religion is that inherently breaks down the logic of human beings to some extent, like how we logically think, like how we generally think that the idea of death equals an end of some suffering, though there isn't a meaningful logical proof behind that ideology, is something that is inherently problematic. That is, it's fine for those who actively get a weekly or a monthly juicing of like religious matters or religious issues, right? But to some extent, to preach in public then means that those few people who are still able to actively engage in discourse and be able to go against religion are probably being endangered, because to some extent they might be lost because of the way in which religious messaging is structured and particularly shaped to end up opting into religion in and of it oneself, which probably in the long run kills things like the ability to have meaningful discourse as a whole. I'm not sure, but that's what I think.
You're
Yeah,
muted.
Yeah, there's
muted.
also a discussion around choice and other aspects. But yes, Anish, you wanted to pitch in? After that, I will speak.
Yeah, if I have to just go against the motion that I would not ban preaching the religion, I understand that the entire aspect of influencing, etc., that can be harmful, and you can necessarily influence or even instigate people into a certain religion and all of that. The problem is that I necessarily don't understand why this must be exclusive to just religion, because at all points in time, you have the rallying of political parties, you have the rallying of candidates, of football teams, of sports teams, etc., etc., which also kind of go ahead and play their part in influencing people. I think, in a very principle level, at least religion is better off because of the fact that religion ideally wants you to be a very principled person, be it any religion, and lead a very principled life. And yes, it has restrictions on it, but that is the main aim of religion, to lead a principled life so that you can get salvation. On the other hand, if you are going to go ahead and vote for a particular candidate, that candidate is purely self-interested to get as many votes as possible, and probably even wants you to vote for policies that would actively harm you at all points in time. Religion at least has no ulterior motive rather than to get the maximum opt-in as possible, to get the maximum amount of, let us say, political, of let us say, people outreach outreach that they can to kind of be followers in that religion, which is not inherently as bad as voting for somebody who would fuck you over in a political election cycle.
Great. Gayatri, you wanted to add something.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So based on the motion, my thoughts are pro to banning is when you take preaching or any type of religious preaching, it's a very broad aspect because it's your that particular person's method of expressing their views on the religion. It can be a regular preaching about gospels or sacraments or even details or stories related to the religion, or it can be on the extreme side of even coercing conversion, right? And we all, I mean, when you take especially South Asian countries and the country that I come from, there is religious extremism, right? And even in countries, even in India, even in Sri Lanka, the country that I'm from, we have a very strong past on religious extremism, even more so than political extremism. And for countries like that, I see it as a pro because when you take religion, there are people who behave more radically and behave more in an extremist manner based on their economic backgrounds, the history of their families, and the religions that they come from. And because of that, I feel it's a pro. And also, there are countries like Singapore who has a religious maintenance act that prevents public religious preaching, which has served them the best because they have had religious extremism issues due to public preachings. So when you take countries like that who has imposed law to ban religious preachings or even control it to a certain extent, they have seen the past of it and have addressed those issues legally, right? And also when you take religion and also as a community and a population, there are people who don't follow any religions, who are who don't believe in God, right? And those people also need to exist. Therefore, making religion as a private conversation and more of a confidential conversations rather than public preachings, it allows people to exercise their freedom of thought and also allow people who don't believe in religion to also coexist and have a sense of belonging in the society, right? And I think as a country, if you ban preachings and also even coercive conversions of people, it is for the betterment, because especially in South Asian countries, or even when you take Israel Palestine war, of course there's a lot of political aspects involved, but when you take it in its core, it removes religious extremism, I feel. Yeah.
Very true. I think Bracy wanted to add something as well.
Yes, confirm if I'm audible. Okay, that's fine. I think on the opposition of this motion, there are two things you can run. Firstly, a chart on how religion is something that is so intrinsic to the identity of people who actively preach it as a whole. There are people who have given up their lives to the idea of wanting to spread the religion which they perceive as being a good message, because that's intrinsically tied to their ability and right to freedom of expression, which is tantamount to their right to self-fulfillment. The idea of preaching in public is something that should remain in existence, because at mere least it provides some form of fulfillment for the people who preach in those public spaces. That is to say, the idea of preaching religion as a whole is a very uncertain matter. You are never sure that when you preach, people are actively going to conform or to actively going to particularly follow your religion. So what this means is two things. It means whenever you weigh it about whether or not you should public, probably you want the most certain outcome. The most certain outcome is probably that people within that religion who are actively preaching are likely to fulfill their goals which they have as a whole. So on the idea of certainty as a weighing scope, you are probably better having preaching in public rather than actively hoping that, okay, we are going to preach in private spaces and hope that people inherently opt into this, because I think there is fulfillment generally of the people who preach that message. But secondly, even on the idea of choice, if government runs that religion is coercive, I think we can very well engage with it in a level that our identity, in as much as we wish and want to say that our identity is intrinsic to us and we are the pioneers in deciding what inherently identifies us as people, to some extent, the idea of your identity is something that never was owned by you, because you ought to conform to certain societal ideas that say it to be fundamental to you as a human being. So in any instance, you all aim to have some form of a private property or some form of things that have inherently been constructed to say, when you have this, you are inherently a better person within society. So even if people preach in public and they coerce you to opt into something which probably will determine your identity, the harm isn't that great, because you don't necessarily own your identity in and of its own self.
A very interesting perspective. Yes, Mami, you wanted to add something?
Okay, so I think for me, we need to understand what the preaching looks like, because what happens in the setting I am used to is in terms of public spaces, because at a sitting, let's say for a church setting, we're having a service from like 6:30 to 9:30. It's a 3 hour something, and it's obviously packed with hundreds of people. So if we are calling that public places, it means that then we are taking some kind of right from these religious bodies, because it then means that they can no longer express themselves, except that they say there's these public spaces refer to like places like outside these religious context. But for me, I think even in these churches, mosques, or wherever it happens, there are still people involved. And insofar as there are more than one or two people, we can still consider it as public. So we need to really understand what this preaching looks like. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Perfect. I think we do have this idea about how, say, the public perceives religion as well, right? Because I think one of the bedrocks of understanding how this motion metric will work is understanding what is the impact of preaching, what is the like stowaway of how preaching, sorry, works in the society. So interesting perspectives. We just have time to do one more. I'll do a quick motion debrief on this, and then you guys can contribute, and then we can wrap up the session as well. This is in a bit of a different topic. Yes. So this motion will be very simply broken down into the ideas of how, say, the gov will operate on the idea of private military contractors being beneficial or not, and say how the national unity government has some proactive stances or some benefits or losses in association with combating the junta in terms of how the situation in Myanmar is. So, what essentially the breakdown would be is that we sort of look at how Western ideologies work in this political spectrum or in this political entity, which is the country of Myanmar. The second thing that we sort of look at is how does this Western countries contribute towards these issues? They are actually utilizing funding. So, this is the key link factor between, say, how the West is operating with the unison of the national unity government and say in the operations in say combating the military junta. The second key part of say analyzing this motion is simply ideating around how private military contractors in and of themselves work in a society or work in a community. And the other part would probably be how the national unity government is operating and what the military junta is about. We can look at these things from say political spectrums of how politics in West want Myanmar to be stable, a political leadership in West wants Myanmar to be stable, and what are say other regional dialogues like countries around Myanmar thinking about these issues and how they're contributing or say not contributing towards the stability of the country or rather detracting the stability of the country in what it is right now. So take some time. You can think about how this motion operates. We can look at say economic perspectives, political perspectives, perspectives of international relations and other ideas. And those would sort of like be the key themes that we'll be engaging in this motion.
May I try if I'm audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. I don't have good knowledge of what's happening in Myanmar, but I think the context is something that's workable with. So I think generally there is a consensus on the West being a displaying party for what we perceive a standard of democracy and a standard of generally trying to enforce democracy within the world. So for the perception that the world has of the West, it's something that is inherently justified for them to try to take out of power governments that have used unjust methods to particularly acquire power in any instance. But secondly, I think this debate can boil down to when is violence particularly justified? Okay, not violence more in its worst term, but I think in the ideas of when is radicalism or when are steps that wouldn't otherwise be taken particularly justified. I think this is when you give structural reasons like if military junta it's probably that strong as a whole, so you need an equally strong force to enter into that region. But the chart then becomes probably it's better to contract private military contractors than it will be probably for the West to send its own armies. I think for the mere ideas of the West currently has had a lot of like backlash on it actively sending its soldiers into war-torn zones. So it becomes far much more tough for it to only inject money insofar much as trying to free Myanmar is concerned. The policy on that will be the West injects money. Probably the NGU is the one that decides on when the PMCs are to particularly act and how they to act. I think that becomes the differentiating factor rather than probably America sending its army into Myanmar, but rather it funds and then the GNU decides probably what is to be done, when, how, and where.
Good. Would anybody else want to contribute as well? Right. I'll just add a couple of things and ideas, right, to what Brihi was already saying. I think the fundamental idea is that West, when they do these particular actions, would also impose certain political restrictions or certain restrictions in terms of, say, maybe giving some kickbacks to, say, Western countries, for instance, resource extraction or other issues. So this very likely that national unity government loses a lot of power and soft power and hard power in the global scenario as well as in the local scenario, and people's perception of this government can also become something which is very problematic in terms of how they can sort of justify actions against the military junta, because junta might certainly just try to bring around the idea that they're fighting for the liberation of these people. On the other end of the spectrum, in this motion, we can discuss ideas around how the military junta has become very problematic in terms of its approach towards engaging with the government, which simply means that they have participated in tactics, which means they've led to a lot of loss of life, which means that there's a lot of importance of international humanitarian assistance, but also in terms of a human rights issue, it's not something that you should really not agree with. The key factor on both sides here then become the idea of how private military contractors operate, and this will be the making or breaking of the case from both sides. So, private military contractors are essentially individuals who have maybe had some military training or some armed forces training in their backgrounds, have retired or been let go of, and who have now got joined these companies who operate sometimes internationally and do aspects like warfare or things which might be problematic, like assassinations or counterinsurgency or insurgency in some places. So, however you frame PMCs would become the relevant point in terms of how you win or lose this debate. Right. So I think we had a very fruitful discussion as well. Thank you, everybody, all of you who joined in today. I will send you all the materials as I was referencing. It's also very important for us to keep in touch with news and current affairs. But what this workshop really boiled down to was the idea about how you read motions better and how you can relate motions to different principles or different themes, which essentially then means that if we share those ideas in terms of like reference material to you as to where you can get news and other priority aspects, you can better access them and you can better deal with them. So after the end of this workshop, we'll sort of like compile a lot of resources and send them across to you over your mails which you submitted while registering. If there are any questions, I'll open the floor for questions for a couple of minutes, and then we'll sort of close out the session. Great. Seeing that there are no questions, thank you so much. We do host a series of workshops. You will find them in the debating WhatsApp group that we had created for workshops, and there's a calendar that we maintain as well. I'm pretty sure most of those topics would be something that is very relevant to you and something that you would be very engaged with as well. So again, heartfelt thanks for everybody who has joined the session today. See you all. Thank you for joining.